All right, welcome to the fourth edition of the Last Month in Security. We are short a guest today, but I've got my usual co-host here, Ryan Golden, CMO here at Halcyon, and our CISO, Ben Carr. How you guys doing today?
How's it going?
Fantastic. Just coming back from RSA and all the chaos.
Good time at RSA.
I didn't get sick. I don't know about you guys, but I managed to get out of the conference without getting a cold.
Yeah.
I didn't get sick at RSA, but when I went home, my kids were sick, and so I got sick the weekend after RSA. So, yeah.
Con flu is always the worst, right? Where you get a little bit of everything from around the world. So too much to talk about in this episode. Ransomware news is just, it's out of control. Really exciting thing, the DBIR is out, and Halcyon made its debut. So, fantastic.
Yeah. I think we're all excited to be included in the DBIR. I think it's, in its 17th, 18th year running now. Yeah. So this is our first inclusion, and really our threat staff as well as our professional services folks contributed as much information as they could to it. So absolutely happy to be involved, and we want to thank the Verizon crew for having us.
Big thanks to Alex Pinto and the Verizon crew out there for involving us, and they're great to work with. So some of the big things coming out of the DBIR this year, they kind of changed the focus a little bit to really focus on pathways to breaches. So how did attackers get into the network? And they looked at amazingly 30,000 plus incidents. More than 10,000 were confirmed data breaches.
I think that was the most that they had included before, right?
Yeah, it was large sample size.
And vulnerability exploits rule right now. So
they're back.
They are 180% increase from the previous year, mostly driven by the MOVEit campaign that Klopp was probably the number one threat actor that engaged in that exploit. We heard anything from 1,000 to 8,000 companies were compromised in that.
Probably more
because we know only a fraction of these attacks are reported to law enforcement and the FBI, and there's really no good single source of information on this. But the DBIR has done a great job. A third of these breaches that were tracked in this report involved ransomware or other extortion means. So
and you mentioned vulnerabilities earlier, and I think we talk a lot about this in the industry about the lack of effective hygiene mitigation, right? Like people just don't fix these things when they're out there, and there's information deeper in the DBIR that actually talks to this a little bit and how much 300 days later, like people still have very high level vulnerabilities that are present in their system, and I think. I think there's even been some movement as of late, like within the last 12 months. I've seen some people come out publishing kind of their thoughts on how people should address vulnerabilities, and some people are saying that we should just really focus on the top exploited stuff. But I don't think that gets at the underlying problem of people just aren't really addressing it effectively and haven't for a long time, right? And the report still speaks to that,
right? And I think. Just to showcase that, I mean, MOVEit was on so many lists of approved software across government agencies and education, and it was sort of on the safe list. And I think that wide adoption and then finding and exploiting a vulnerability in it it's the perfect storm.
Well, really. and could they do these numbers of compromises if there wasn't automation involved in this? Do you think?
Not at the speed and scale, for sure.
Because I think Klopp. Was thousands, 1,000 to 4,000 organizations compromised in a matter of weeks, 6 to 8 weeks.
And I think there was some information about them years prior to it being publicly sort of announced, have been testing this as well. So it wasn't. I don't think it was just Klopp, right? I think once it became public,
quite a few. And it's kind of interesting.
Jumped into it.
After Klopp hit MOVEit really hard last spring and summer, they kind of started fading. Q3 of last year, they almost were off the map. They're kind of back in Q4, and now they're kind of gone. So,
it speaks to the incentive too, right? So, I mean, if you think about ransomware, one of the differences I think we've published and we've talked about is that they're trying to get first mover advantage in this business, and when they see something, they're trying to go after it. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been a lot of dwell time for other actors that have been taking advantage of these vulnerabilities when they've been out there. It's a wide open field. I mean, if you're leaving these vulnerabilities out there for people to take advantage of, and then even to top it off worse, I think, when we see these incidents and they get widespread, it's because somebody's done the recon and research to figure out where they are, and they have probably better insight into your assets than you do. And so that's the other thing, right? We're not managing the assets. When any large vulnerability comes out, one of the things that operators usually struggle with is figuring out, okay, what's my footprint look like?
Right.
Where is it?
Yeah, exactly. How exposed am I?
Yeah.
Right. And also, we don't really talk about the information sharing that happens as well. Like there's as much cross-pollination as I guess information sharing and security on the other side of the fence as well too. So,
Well, a little factoid I don't have in our notes here for the show, but last year CISA notified several thousand organizations of vulnerabilities that put them at risk, and less than half took action. So it kind of goes back to what we were talking about last night at dinner, right? So here we've got ransomware from the DBIR remains top threat across 92% of industries. So at 9 out of 10 industries. So there's one major industry that's not getting hammered by ransomware. And you asked me an interesting question last night. Why are we just not taking this seriously enough? I mean, doesn't this seem like there should be a little bit more kind of
are you just setting this up for
ransomware
Halcyon?
specifically? Like our discussion was like, this is such a large topic. Changes. I hate to go back to change healthcare, right? But it's obviously such a large footprint that it's affected so many people that when we think about that, like it just calls into question, why aren't people more focused on this? Why aren't they addressing the core problem?
I think in part, and you could jump in with your CISO hat as a former practitioner and now podcast host. And there's a lot of noise. Like it is absolutely a top concern, but I know that CISOs and security teams out there also have 10,000 other things, right? Everything from credential management to patching and vuln management. It's brutal out there, right? And automation has accelerated the attackers just as much as it's accelerated defenders too.
Well, so last week I was doing some work on some kind of board prep for myself, right? Looking at how we talk about this at the board level, how CISO start to become part of that conversation at the board. And I think that's part of the discussion is the prioritization of what people are addressing, right? But I think I may have talked about it in one of the shows past, but this shiny ball syndrome that a lot of people have. And it's kind of like, what's the hot thing? It lasts for like 5 seconds, and then we drift off to the other hot thing. And I think a lot of people in the security industry want to figure out, operate on the operation side, right? Somebody in the CISO's org, it's like, where's the sexy part that I can focus on because it's cool? And so again, the hygiene, the assets, it's the same thing in the IT side. Why haven't we addressed the asset problem? Because it's not cool, it's not sexy, right? It's like, what's the next cloud infrastructure that we focus on? Okay, let's pivot there. Let's not worry about
or generative AI.
What do we have? Right? Yeah, generative AI was all over RSA, right? Like you couldn't go anywhere without somebody hitting you in the face with an AI billboard. But it's just a question of like, are we going to focus on that? Are we going to focus on the things that really move the bubble and change? And some of those aren't really that expensive, right?
I think in part it's hard, right? I mean, software vulnerability management from somebody that consumes it is difficult. Not to mention folks that are building it, as we saw with SolarWinds, right? So I think the problem is like it's a BHAG, right? It's a big, hairy, audacious kind of thing that you have to like wrap your head around. And unfortunately, it only gets brought up, I think, in cases like MOVEit, where there is widespread abuse of a vulnerability.
Well, this concept of it was another concept of this conference I was at, this board level conference, systemic risk, right? It's a systemic risk. It's something that like when it gets, it may be a small part, but the ramifications it has in the rest of the security footprint in your organization, then potentially the third parties you deal with, the vendors you deal with, like that expanding onion, it's massive. And so I think that's, like you have to think about that in these terms. Like any risk to your organization that's a systemic risk is something you have to figure out how are you going to mitigate, how are you going to control. Otherwise, it can own you.
And not to be too pluggy for Halcyon, but I think this is in part why we really focus on preventing and helping to recover from ransomware incidences as they happen, as opposed to really worried about the initial attack vectors and how folks are getting in. We sort of assume that by one of these 10,000 ways, people are going to be moving across the network laterally, and our focus is on stopping that execution of ransomware, despite how it came in, right? And I think that's where Halcyon really comes into its own, is as that kind of like last line of defense.
Yeah, one of the things I've always liked is the systemic nature of what we try to do, right? We're not just focused on the prevention, and for me as an operator, that's what I tend to focus on. But I know a lot of people also like the ability of the key capture, right? The potential for preventing data exfiltration. Like it's thinking about it in a holistic way and how you get in front of that. And I think that's where people need to start focusing on how they're addressing the larger security risks. Is how do you look at a holistic approach to the problem you're having, put the right amount of dollars and effort into that, address ransomware the right way, address your whatever your highest breach is, whatever you need to prioritize, but then move on to the next thing, right? But get a good hold on it. Don't chase AI. I mean, yeah, you need to have a solution for it. You need to be able to address it. You're not going to stop the intrusion of AI into your enterprise, but it can't consume you, right? Like you can't pivot 90% of your security budget to an AI footprint and forget about everything else, because in the end, it's not going to matter.
Well, to that, I mean, there's multiple security things that happen prior to a ransomware payload being detonated, right?
Yeah.
But given the potential impact, back to a point that you made in like the first show, it's like, okay, there's a keylogger, they're stealing some information and stuff, but business goes on, right? Ransomware, doesn't it seem like I don't know, there should be a little bit more angst around the potential impact for this, things that we're seeing with Change Healthcare and stuff, and that we're just kind of saying, another cybercrime problem, 1 in 3 people in the United States affected by it. I mean, that seems like it's...
Well, I've heard a lot of conversation about this, right? And at RSA, there were a lot of sidebar conversations and CISOs getting together and talking about this. And I think one of the things that I heard a lot is it's single sourced, right? Like, so who else are you going to go to? Who else do you pivot to, right? So I think, with the SolarWinds issue, yes, they, no matter how they addressed it, at the end of the day, like who else were you necessarily going to go to, right? In the Change Healthcare incident, like who's the other vendor that you switch to? And even if you theoretically had another vendor that's like a close number 2 or a distant 3, how much time does it take you to get there? And what work have you done on the front side as part of your organization to figure out like a resiliency method of how would I switch?
Right.
If your O365 went down tomorrow, God forbid, what are you going to do? Like, how do you take the backups? How do you move them to Google? How do you switch? Like, nobody tests that, right? Like, people test their DR and their BCP, but at the end of the day, they're not really testing it. They're testing the playbook and the process, but they're not doing a full recovery effort. And then they're not considering the worst case. What happens if the vendor is not available for 3 months or 6 months or even 2 weeks? Like, what do you do in that interim time period?
Like software migration is such a huge hassle, and we know this as folks that have sold enterprise security for years and years and years. Just the thought of having to swap out a control for another one is a huge blocker to adopting software, right? And I know I've migrated platforms that we've used in marketing on several occasions, and it's enormous. So when you have a single source vendor like that, that's a planned process, right? So an on-the-fly swap out of a processor, a payment processor, or something like that is just you almost don't want to open that Pandora's box. I think a lot of times.
So there's just kind of inherent inertia in these security programs, and being able to make a switch on the fly. These attackers are innovating very, very fast.
As a CISO, would you have planned for something like, okay, assume compromise of one of the major parts of our business, and that's not just a security function, right? That's a accounting function, or it's something else. It's multiple departments.
So look, honestly, like 6 months, a year ago, 2 years ago, casually, right? Like I would have thought about it, but it's entering my sphere of like, okay, how do I think about the real threats to the organization? And one of the most interesting things is if you start to think about the guidance on materiality that's come out. We were talking about this a little pre-show. There's some interesting thought out there that if you look at the materiality, it is the impact to your business material. It doesn't say is the security impact to your business material, is the impact. Yeah. And so when you start to think about that way, well, what happens if one of your key vendors just went away? Like, let's not even take a security incident. What if they went away? What are you doing BCP DR to get back up and running? And would you have to report on that? And so I think as people start to take that larger sphere and think about reporting, I think people are going to have to start to look at that. And I think, you wanted to talk a little bit about MOVEit, right? I mean, that's a vendor, right? Like when I was at Qualys, we had issues with a vendor, right? That was a file transfer protocol, Halcyon. That was something like, if that vendor wasn't available anymore, like what are we doing? And in the incident, you're certainly having those discussions, like what happens if we can't get up? But I don't think anybody is, few people are thinking about the long-term ramifications of what happens if I have to switch these vendors. And I think that's something that CISOs are really going to have to focus on. And I would question, does again start to elevate the CISO up to another level of discussion within the organization? Is it really, is it a risk officer? Is it a security officer? It can't be information security anymore.
Right. It's broader than that. It's
not,
business
right?
security.
It's business resiliency. It's making sure that you're addressing all the risks to the business that are relevant to the business in a prioritized fashion. Sure. And that's a board discussion.
And MOVEit is just one of hundreds of pieces of software in use throughout an organization, right? And you're going to have this plan for everyone.
Yeah. How can you possibly quantify risk at that kind of granular level? Like you said, you had a good example when we were talking before the show of what about when the power goes out for 4 hours?
Yeah, I don't think you can quantify everything, right? And I don't think that's the intent. But the intent is to look at things from a strategic value perspective, from a risk perspective, prioritize those things. And so if your business, if it couldn't function, if again, I use it with 365. Let's say you were using Google, right? If either one of those systems went down and that was your framework for doing business and you couldn't operate anymore, then that's a primary business system and you need to have a way to figure out that. Now, again, you can't stand up tomorrow and say, okay, I've addressed all 10 critical business systems, right? My Oracle ERP, my O365, you can't do that. But what you can do is say, okay, I'm going to take O365 first. And then 6 months from now, we're going to figure out what we would do from an Oracle perspective. And maybe the answer is we're not going to have a great solution, but at least we can continue on from a continuity perspective. At least you've thought about it. You've had the discussion. You've had that discussion with the other C-level staff, the board. What does that look like? Because I think the worst thing for any incident, right? Life, limb, security, business, don't talk about it when it's happening. Have a discussion before it's happening and be able to figure out where you're going to go.
Right. Okay, with this new,
and that was one of the things cloud was supposed to address, right? One of the reasons why we went to cloud was it was supposed to open up this era of more transportability. If a vendor wasn't operating in the way they should, you could theoretically move. But it's almost like it's locked us in more to these vendors because we don't know how to do anything anymore ourselves. We outsource everything. And I've always been a fan of saying you can outsource the task, but not the risk. And I think a lot of people are outsourcing the risk and they're giving up the control of saying, oh, this is something I have to work with and something I have to figure out and plan.
Right. I no longer have the 2U I can go and read.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, on the materiality note, given this new enlightenment that you've had as a CISO, has that made it easier? Is there a lot of subjectivity to this? I mean,
well,
what if you guess wrong?
Yeah. So I guess I would say it's a well-defined area. And it's also early days, right? So if you think about materiality, we've really talked about it in terms of the financials, right? So if something happened material and the CFO and legal understood it, they could kind of figure out how to react to it. But those things are fairly static in the way that they happen generally, right? They can move quickly, but it's something well understood generally.
So MOVEit exploits as an example. Okay, so let's say you're seeing it get compromised widely. Huge numbers and stuff, higher risk of getting ransomware.
But it also moves very quickly, right? So that's the information change that happens when a MOVEit event happens. So, you've got to identify materiality in 4 days now. And you've got to make a report. You're a public company, so now you've got to make a filing. You've got to figure out, is it material? Am I just offering a guidance report? How are you doing that?
What do you say?
And it's not as simple as the 8K. There's also other forms like a 701. And it gets really deep in
so
this,
when you disclose, we are using this product, it's getting exploited widely.
It depends. Is it material to your organization? That's the question. How do you define materiality? Just now imagine. So let's say you're a publicly traded organization. You're using MOVEit, but it's just in a testing phase, and you don't have any customer data on it. It's probably not material, right? Let's say you have all your customer data on it. It's been exposed globally. You've had to notify customer. Once you start to have to notify part of the general public, then if you're publicly traded, like how does that impact investors if you're not generally notifying them, right? So there's a lot of conversations around this, but the difference in like in information security and IT is something that affects CI and A. Let's put it that way, because that affects everything, right? Availability. If it's CI and A and it comes to the CISO, I think the question is, how do you determine all this in a very short period of time? Update stakeholders who probably aren't as in touch with the specifics and the technical aspects as you are.
While managing the incident.
While managing the incident and driving to stay in control, right? So because the last thing as a CISO or the security guys you want to be is kind of hair on fire running around like you don't know what's going on. Right. So you're trying to, be the guy who's calm, who's steady, who has the plan. Again, you have to test for it ahead of time. But I think we're just in a very new area of trying to figure all of this out, where you had to figure it out before, but there weren't the compliance guidelines around it and the drive to get it done. And I think the larger thing is probably then the SEC is people are going to have to start looking at investors. What happens with investor lawsuits that come in as a result of this, right? You thought you didn't need to disclose, so you didn't, and then investors come in and say, "Oh, stock price dropped greatly. Like we're going to sue you because you didn't disclose." Like, there's a lot of stuff in this, right?
Well, this is kind of nuance. This is an really interesting line that you've taken here, because we're coming up on the 1 year anniversary of the bulk of the MOVEit exploits.
This weekend, I believe, right? Memorial Day. Everyone
weekend.
loves
exploit. If you're a CISO, don't go on vacation and don't expect your holidays to be fun, right? That's when it comes.
And weekends, right? Yeah. So it's been a year. There's still organizations that haven't patched. They're still vulnerable. So, I mean, in the materiality conversation now, you've identified something that's a material risk. You've made the notifications. You've done the filings. What's the expectation that you're going to address it now?
How do you mean? Define that a little bit more. What do you mean?
What is the expectation now that you've identified something that's materially impacting the business, and now it's a year later, and your organization is still exposed? I mean, what's the responsibility of the CISO to jump on something like that?
If you've disclosed something that's a material incident for your company, I'm hoping a year later, you've done something.
Well, they issued patches, right? I know that there was obviously hot fixes issued for their on-prem variants,
patches
as well
available
as
even before the bulk of the exploits happen. So.
Yeah, I guess so. If you think about that, so there's something that the vendor has to do, right? So the vendor has to make those patches available. Let's say you're a third party though that's consuming that vendor software, and now you've had to disclose this material vulnerability. Like, how did you identify the scope? Like, do you know where you have all the implementations? Is there something sitting off that's connected to the internet somewhere that only 3 people use, that uses MOVEit, that you didn't realize a year later? Like, that would probably be a big problem, right? So how did you go and look at what the entire scope was? How did you put a plan in to address it? And look, it's certainly an acceptable response to say, hey, we're going to accept the risk, right? Now that question is like, did you accept it appropriately, right? Is it a low amount of risk with a low amount of likelihood? Yeah, you're probably okay.
Right. Were your controls to assess that risk in place?
Do you put additional controls in place? Did you remediate the vulnerability? I mean, there's a whole through line to think about, like how you address it appropriately. But that's the key, is you've addressed it appropriately in a business context. Because look, business is about doing something, right? For a lot of software organizations, it's about selling software. For GM, it's about making cars, right? So you've got to do that thing that business is in place for correctly and to meet the shareholder value. But there's all these other associated things, security being one of them, that's to protect that line of business, right? And so how have you done that appropriately to make sure you're meeting all those goals and you're supporting the business at the same time? So it can't be we're going to give security all the money and sales doesn't get any, but it certainly shouldn't be sales got all the cash to try to drive revenue and security didn't get any, because you're not doing your due diligence there either.
Right. Well, and I believe MOVEit was initially found by a customer.
Yeah.
Right. And reported through whatever their ticketing system is, or submitting a bug or something like that.
Yep.
So
we're seeing is on-prem and cloud-based versions. I mean, it was quite the vulnerability, right?
And I think that's, we see that in software industry. I think we've all seen that, right? Where a customer or somebody else has reported something and it hasn't been self-discovered. And then it goes on for a while, right? Because there's this, we're going to push it off because it's not critical to fix right now. But God help you if you get compromised before you actually move to the fix.
And I believe that the maker Progress did jump on it very, very quickly, right? I would hope that at any 9.8 CVE severity score issue would be jumped on.
Yeah, I didn't hear a lot of criticism, about their.
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's been general support, right? I mean, I think SolarWinds is a good example of that.
Right.
I mean, a lot of people are not happy with what happened. They're supporting Tim Brown. They're supporting the transparency, all that. And so, I think if you do things right, the industry will generally support you for doing that. We know mistakes happen, right? But it's when you do things really wrong that people get really aggravated, and that's not.
Well, that's an interesting one too, because if you remember, when Okta had a little bit of an issue, and they were, I think, doing the best they could to be transparent, and in doing so, they kind of were talking before they had the information necessary, and then things change, and the scope changes and everything like that, and they got a lot of criticism. They got beat up, for trying to be transparent, right? So from a CISO point of view, how do you deal with that challenge of trying to?
Well, it's a fine line too, right? Get beat up for transparency. You can be transparent, but if you did things wrong to get to that level of transparency, that's still
it only buys you so much.
Yeah, back. Right. If it's something that you couldn't have been foreseen and you've done all the right things, I think that's again the best case scenario, right? Code is hard. There's a lot of lines of code in software nowadays. It's not like it was 30, 40 years ago. And even then we had a ton of vulnerabilities, right? So it's not the job of being a software vendor hasn't got any easier. But as the industry, do you have a CISO? Do you have a good program? Are you adhering? Do you have policies in place? Are you adhering to your policies, right? Or are you doing stupid stuff? You don't have a CISO, you don't have policies, you've got no MFA, that's again where people are going to come after you for stuff. Right?
Absolutely.
So I think it's a balance, and in every situation, you're going to have to look at the specifics.
Right. And I know we've spent quite a bit on the MOVEit. Maybe to wrap up on some of the Verizon DBIR findings, since I think we all look forward to that report coming out every year. It is one of the one of the top annual reports.
Sure. They classified the breaches in 4 different ways. You want to run through a couple of those breaches involving unwitting human.
Unwitting human versus malicious insider. I like the fact that they started to separate out in these reports, sort of like the malicious insider versus somebody getting phished. I think that's important. I think one of the other interesting things that I saw was the split between ransomware and pure exfiltration, right? So obviously the data exfiltration leads to the double extortion campaigns, where if you're not going to pay the ransom initially to unlock your data, well, guess what? We've also taken it and we're going to release it on a leak site. I think this is kind of an important thing to know, that they're splitting out certain attacks that are just going after the exfiltration of data. So ransomware-less ransomware, essentially, right?
Beyond Leon was one of the first ones who kind of, I think their source code was leaked, 2 years ago, and and then they basically just do smash and grabs.
Exactly, well, and I think the important thing is to know that of the actions that were taken, sort of like post breach, what was it? 32% of them involved ransomware and exfiltration, and I think so. A third basically of every activity that was tracked in that report had some kind of a ransomware, extortion, exfiltration component to it.
Yeah.
So for the folks that are saying
breaks
that
down as 23% with ransomware payloads, 9% straight data extortion.
So what you're saying is ransomware is in fact not going anywhere, and maybe rumors of its death are exaggerated over the past couple of years.
Yeah, look, I think if you have to, people are looking for the shortest path to monetary gain, right? And so when they see that they can exfiltrate data and get monetary gain off that, and sometimes, look, depending upon the organization, it may be more monetarily efficient to look at the data you exfiltrate than the company that had the data in the first place, because I've seen, and I know we've seen, many instances where it's not just the double extortion. So, think Change Healthcare. They got extorted for $22 million, and they take the data, and they somebody else is being asked for it. And then what happens on the third, the fourth, the fifth extortion, right? Because they're taking that data and say, oh, you have a customer. I'm going to ask that customer for data, but also related to that customer with some other information related to that customer's vendor or that customer's customer. And so that chain can go on. And so I think the exfiltration is sometimes much more lucrative than the actual, the initial ransomware that happens, and people are going to look for how to extend that chain.
And I've thought, and hopefully I'm not incepting any ideas, that the triple extortion would be, I'm also going to put puts onto your company stock when this goes live.
Yeah, right? that was one of the early variations of the double extortion would be.
So also insider trading there, I might add, right? If you're doing that,
or offering that information to sale. For sale to competitors, doing other things, but the shorts is something that they've definitely seen. What else do we have in the DBIR there? Remaining 15% of the attacks were due to supply chain compromises.
Increase in sort of supply chain attacks is not surprising. I know there's a lot of focus and a lot of good companies that are focused on, the creating SBOMs for people to understand what third party and open source software they're implementing in their own software development chain as well. So no surprise there that I think that has picked up.
To highlight even on the SBOM thing and the third party risk, like that's a bigger challenge sometimes, right? Because you have control over your own enterprise and organization and footprint. But let's look at healthcare, right? Like in healthcare is really, when you look at the report, a large target for a lot of this. In healthcare, a lot of that risk comes from potential third-party stuff where, I have an SBOM, but the person who makes that medical device is never going to update the firmware. And so, great, I know it's vulnerable, but what do I do about it? Right? So that's a big challenge. When you look at a company like General Motors, right, or a Ford, when they don't own, they contract out to a third party, Delphi or somebody, to make a system in their car, but then they don't even have the authority to go and modify that system that operates in the larger system. So it becomes that systemic risk that's just all over the enterprise.
And you can continue to extend that.
Yeah, keep going down.
7 degrees of Kevin Bacon all the
way
down.
Where do they know, right? Exactly. Like, how do you know? So I think third party is something that's going to get worse and worse and worse as it goes on, unless we figure out a way to kind of enforce that chain and make sure that...
From a regulatory perspective?
I think it's going to have to be somewhat regulatory, and it's going to have to be kind of an industry accepted thing, right? And that the industry says, look, I can't tolerate if I accept 6 chains of risk and I have nothing to do about them, right? I mean, again, let's look at an auto manufacturer. If an auto manufacturer gets compromised by a fifth party, what does that do to them?
And they all share suppliers.
Yeah,
anyway,
they all.
So
and it people start to a couple of people die because cars run off the road or somebody does something. That's a really, really bad day. So I have to see them getting in front of that, especially as they see themselves more as digital companies and less as manufacturing
just hard goods.
Well, given those complexities and just how many moving parts there are, I've heard criticism of SBOM as being kind of a fool's errand, in the sense that if you build it, it's almost going to be impossible to maintain, right? It's almost as big of a mess as not knowing what's in your systems.
Well,
not what's running.
I think anytime you know everything, it's a better day 100%. At the races. The problem is, I guess my question is, okay, so now what do you do with it, right? It's like if I don't know what the equivalency for this is, but like if you knew that there were a bunch of people who were coming to break into your house tonight, but you couldn't get home, like, what does that help you? Like, you're still, all your stuff's going to be gone when you get back from your vacation, right? But if you could call the cops and say, hey, my alarm went off, you got to get somebody there, that you have that response or that compensating control. I think that's what we need here, is like some way to say, okay, if I'm going to use software, I have to have the rights to either enforce you to fix third-party software that you're using in your supply chain, or I have to have the ability to patch it and not cause a problem for the rest of that software stack.
Right. Well, and even just not having the chaos of, remember the first 3-4 days of Log4Shell was, is it in our software?
Sure. Yeah, just being able to
our
figure
customers
it
are
so
SBOM addresses that problem, right? Like, hopefully addresses that problem. But again, I would say, like, so you got you're a large system integrator and you're putting something together and you put your SBOM together and you deliver it right to the end customer. But what about did they get an SBOM for all their stuff? That like it's that chain of evidence, the chain of custody. It's that long tail that is typically the problem. And again, how do you have rights and control if it's the fifth guy away? How do you make sure? So that's what we have to fix, is that connection point.
Okay, cool. Well, let's shift a little bit to the bad guys, right? Ransomware on the move here. The Halcyon ransomware malicious quarter. Yeah, it dropped for Q1 2024.
Anthony's baby.
My little baby. Some like big things. So after doing this for a year, Lockbit, Black Cat were sitting on top, the whole time.
And this is the malicious quadrant.
The malicious quadrant,
about,
yes.
right?
The Halcyon malicious quartile. We have to say quartile.
Your notes state otherwise.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a hard one to get around.
The Halcyon malicious quartile.
Yeah, you should have heard us.
Only to be referred to as such.
Doing bad things. Yeah.
Yes. So Black Cat Alfie, of course, was the subject of a law enforcement takedown, and then they kind of did what's suspected to be, basically an exit scam, ran away with $22 million of a from the United Health Group.
Yeah, and that's come back, right? Like several times, people saying, hey, we still have the data. We still want to get paid. That's right.
And to note this, so this is was this the Q1 or the Q2?
This is Q1 2024.
Q1, that's right.
Yep.
So in similar fashion to the Verizon DBIR, which runs October to October, your quartile is ranked the previous quarter, right?
Yep.
As the dust has settled and groups have moved around. So
when
we're talking about things
so
that are
when are you
happening
going
this
to get
week
so
a little
good
bit
that
different.
you can do it like for this quarter, including the upcoming month? I want to see that.
Don't give my boss any ideas. Or I'll be doing this thing monthly. It's things move really, really fast. So there's really no way to kind of get a comprehensive idea of what happened in the quarter.
So the retroactive tends to give us a little bit more insight.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And with a lot of these texts, things just trickle out. Things are moving really fast. The other one that back on Black Cat Alfie. So who immediately emerged right after the exit scam is Ransom Hub. Super active, rising fast. Just emerged in this Q1 2024 report. I think we're going to see a lot more out of them.
First placement, they were not on the previous one at all.
No, not at all.
So rebrand, different group. Like what's your?
That's what we're seeing as far as some of the analysis out there. That there's again, Orange Cyber does that fantastic kind of genealogy of the groups, and that seems the best evidence right now is that Ransom Hub is a rebrand, or at least some of the actors from Black Cat Alfie. Another big movement is Lockbit. So while I was putting together the report, Lockbit was really dropping out of there, except they're not. So just in this last data I was looking at in this last 2 weeks, dozens and dozens of attacks by Lockbit, and then we get into the thing, of course. So Lockbit is the ransomware. It's also the ransomware developer. It's the platform. It's the RAS group. It's not the affiliates, right? So it gets a little confusing. So is there just affiliates out there who have the payload and they're still using it, still dropping it there? Lockbit SUP has apparently been identified by the UK National Crime Agency as a 31-year-old Russian national named Dmitry. I'll just stop there. My Russian's not good enough to do his full name. But yet, the attacks persist. So I mean, it's very difficult to put a finger on who's doing what here, right?
Well, I think we all know attribution is loose.
Yeah.
In general across cyber. Right.
Yeah.
So.
And a lot of these same actors, I mean, so if you're an affiliate, you could be, and we've even seen this in attacks where, let's say they failed 3 times to get Akira to detonate, so they grabbed another piece of ransomware from another RAS platform and dropped it in there. So it's really kind of, it's difficult.
It's all about the Benjamins, right? Like whatever you can do to monetize and however you can get there. Yeah.
But yeah, LAO hammered both Lockbit and Alfie. Are these takedowns very effective? I mean, we've obviously seen some evidence that there was a little bit of a lull in Q1. Other evidence shows that, ransomware attacks have not slowed down. There's new groups emerging.
I still think they're necessary.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, as much international cooperation and law enforcement actions against, developers groups is like, you can't really have none. You have to have at least some level.
Yeah. I think we'd all like to see more though, right? You really can't have too many. The problem is just how effective is it and what is actually being done to get in the way. And I think a lot of it is they're trying, but
there's limitations.
As good as they can.
There's a lot of limitations, right?
New front runners, by default, haven't necessarily gotten that much more active, but because Lockbit and Black Cat have kind of faded a little bit. We've got Play, Black Basta, 8base, and Acura kind of really leading the way. Kind of curious, and it goes back to our last conversation. So back in the day, with the defacements, the early hackings and stuff like that, a lot of it was about the street cred, kind of making a name for yourself. Do you guys kind of see that there's some groups like Play who don't necessarily go for the biggest ransom, demand possible? There's steady income. You've got others like Lockbit, who obviously was the highest volume. Clop was definitely a high volume one. No Escape was fairly. I mean, is there kind of different
I think it's a risk
personalities
profile.
in these?
I think it's a different risk profile, right? And as we've seen with certain groups, you can fly a little bit too close to the sun, and once you get really like national, international coverage on something, we saw this a little bit with Colonial Pipeline, right? That maybe you don't want that much heat looking into your organization, and so why not be under the radar and sort of be consistent, but not necessarily have these widespread kind of attacks.
Yeah, and you called out something from the DBIR about how some of these groups are just still doing kind of the small spray and pray kind of stuff, small ransom demands.
Right? Yeah, it's a lifestyle business.
I think it'd be interesting to actually get somebody involved from kind of the business psychology side to actually look at it and see if there's any profiles actually profiling, right? Like how do we profile to actually look at this in a different way? When I was at Visa, one of the things we did is we brought in some people from a math background into the cyber side because they were just able to look at the data set differently than we were, right? And look at profiles, look at things that come out of the data that you would have never seen as a cyber person because you're trying to look for the actors.
You're too zoned in on your
right, where they're saying, if you pivot this way, you can see this arise out of the data, and it's like, that's much more interesting, right? I can pivot my response a different way. So it'd be interesting to see if, maybe long term, there's anything we can look at from that side to profile like where we're actually seeing somebody who maybe doesn't ask for very large ransoms, but they're asking for very consistent low, and they're much more of a problem, right? Just that data set would be really interesting to pull.
Well, then
you're adding to the workload that Anthony has.
Sometimes I like to make it a little more difficult on Anthony.
Okay. But some of those lower demands and stuff really kind of skew some of the numbers that we're seeing, right?
Some of the data, yeah. I know that there's obviously sort of average ransom ask, and that's going to be quite a bit different if it's a 10-person organization and a 10,000-person organization. I know. A lot of these groups, they're clever and they will peg an ask to a certain percentage of revenue, and whether it's a publicly traded company and you can actually look at their revenue, or as part of your exfiltration campaign, they've come across reports and Excel files from accounting and can read a fiscal sheet and then determine what is the appetite of an organization to pay for.
Does the ransomware industry mature and the extortion industry mature, where they actually start to look at it just like I was saying from the from the defensive side, but on the attacker side, do they start to look at that and look at maybe a company has a very large revenue number, but they're not actually if you look at all the other data that makes it up, they're not willing to pay, right?
Right.
And so do they get more targeted and more specific?
I think they're there.
Certainly see it.
I think they're there. I mean, you almost have for an organization, you could almost view it as sort of like what is your acceptable percentage of shrinkage or loss due to theft, right? If you go and ask for the I need $100 million, kind of an ask, no, it's going to be the answer, but maybe 500K is sort of a let's just
you see that in the
away.
psychology of the real world, right? So there are certain cities that have made rules that say we're not going to prosecute somebody for crime if it's under a certain dollar amount. You see people stealing, like walking in and stealing off the shelves of things that are just under that dollar amount, right? To stay away from that. And so,
I'd love to see the economic calculations from some of the groups. Like, do they have an Excel spreadsheet that's
how do
based
they
on
figure
XREV?
this out? It'd be super interesting to figure that out.
I mean, a $50 million ransom demand, makes headlines, right? But then when you see some of the stats,
but will it get paid? I mean, that's rare.
Pivot back to change. Like, did they have information that would lead them to believe $22 million was the number? And I'm sure they started out at a much higher number and it was negotiated down, right? But when they look at change, did they, after the change incident and as much as it blew up, did they go, oh crap, we should have asked for a lot more money, right? Is that level of sophistication there yet, or are we going to see it? Right? Are they going to run Monte Carlo scenarios?
Do ransomware groups have actuaries? Is what you're getting at?
That's what.
Right. I'm sure they do. But when you start seeing, when there's so many attacks with smaller dollar amounts being asked for and stuff, and then, as a practitioner, you see, 50 to 500,000. Well, I can just kind of write that into the budget, right? We can absorb that. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of skewing the how you're looking at the problem, rather than looking at all the factors like downtime, like potential legal liability, regulatory liability, and start adding those numbers up? It starts to get much bigger impact to the organization.
Well, look, when you're sitting in the seat and you're having the discussion at the C-level, I think prior to an incident, there's probably this general concept of, are we going to pay or aren't we going to pay? And I would say a lot of organizations haven't really done a ransomware exercise, ran through it with very specifics, like, okay, this part of the business is down now, this change happened and this part of the business is down, or this vendor is calling you. Like, if you're not running through all that, you don't have the full perspective. So there's a general conception of, we're not going to pay or we are going to pay. But when you get into the scenario, a lot of people quickly get to, we're going to pay, just because it's easier to get out of it, right? So it does depend.
You're going to have to pay either way, whether it's in IR or
you are, right?
Right.
So again, it gets back to a discussion we had a couple episodes ago about, like, is there a different way from a national level to deal with this? Is there some type of, if we said, you can't pay, does the government then step in with some type of fund or something to help with the recovery efforts, right? Like, do we change the script on the economics for the actors? And I think that's the only way.
Well, I don't think we have all the information about MGM and Caesars. Probably never will. But one paid $15 million, I think. Caesars paid somewhere around that. MGM, I think the costs are more than $100 million that they ended up spending on the recovery, and probably more since then.
Well, and I think with the reporting guidelines with the SEC stuff, we're going to see a lot better fidelity information a year from now than we do know now, because it's what was reported, right? But I think is that don't pay the ransom? Is that a hard argument to when you look at the difference between a $15 million ransom payment plus IR or $100 million in recovery costs? Well, I think that all depends upon how well you prepped, right? So you pay, but you paid $22 million, and now you get hit again for an ask for another $22 million. You still have all the larger impact of all this stuff going out, right? What are your options, right? I mean, I think if it's somebody's going to die, that's a hard choice for somebody to say, I'm not going to pay the ransomware. If it's, we're going to have some financial impact, and like, okay, what do we do to recover, and what's the choice if we don't? I mean, that's a more nuanced discussion about it. But I think that's certainly, something that's going to have to evolve, and we're going to have more discussions about it.
Right.
Oh, so that kind of gets back to the data exfil. Is the data exfil worse than the ransomware payload? In some
I think that
instances?
depends. Depends on the company, depends on the industry, right? PII, PHI, things that are regulatorily going to be, have some kind of a fine coming down to you, versus to the point of a casino. If you take down all the slot machines, like, that's very big material, instant impact, right? So I think it really just depends on the organization.
Yeah. Are you disrupting the operation, or are you threatening the long-term impact? Like, those are two separate things. They could be both happening at the same time, but they're two separate things you have to kind of make that business evaluation for. So
would it be foolish to pay to try to protect your data that's been exfiltrated with any expectation that
I don't think we can pass a judgment on any system that's been in that.
Yeah, look,
I mean, but do you think
the devil's in the details? The devil's in the details. But like, my advice to any organization is don't pay, right? Like, that's just the upfront advice I would give, and I think that's what all the experts will say: don't pay, right? Now, what happens behind closed doors, the discussion gets a lot more nuanced, right? But it's part of, okay, you're going to pay the ransomware. Do you actually think that you'll get all the data back? Like, what's the reality of that?
And now that you've paid, you're viewed as this is a cash cow to continue to milk. Right.
And you're more likely, I think it was like up to 4 times more likely to get extorted in the future, because you paid once, so you're obviously going to pay again, right? At some point, you're going to run out of cash, but you're likely to pay again. But also, like, if I put my CISO hat on, I think, okay, well, what's the impact? If the data gets exfiltrated, The only thing I'm hoping to protect against is like potentially like a larger lawsuit or larger impact. Like if my competitors get that same data I have, then maybe they can come to market with a product faster than I can, or beat me to it, right? If it's something that could cause harm or impact potentially, but if it's I don't have to report, well, the data got exfilled. You have to report one way or the other, so you don't remove that impact. You don't remove that realized risk, right? So that's part of the challenge for me is like, what do we, if we pay, what do we get out of it?
Sure. Right.
Yeah, and that behind the closed doors conversation is interesting, right? Because I think I saw a stat, I don't have it in front of me, that the vast majority of organizations that have paid a ransom also had do not pay in their policies already, right? So what kind of factors could? Yeah,
I mean,
what changed it?
So you haven't had a ransomware incident yet. Your policy says do not pay. You walk into the, it happens today. You walk into that meeting with the execs and it's like, wow, this is a lot more impactful for us than we thought. Like our name's in the paper. If you're, the concept of having something bad happen and then something bad actually happening, you're dealing with like an emotional component that wasn't present in the forethought. And that's why I say like one of the best things you can do for anything in cyber is run those tabletop exercises.
Can you capture that in a tabletop exercise though?
Not 100%, but you can capture it a lot more than just like going into a room and saying, hey, should we pay ransomware or not? I don't think so. Okay, let's write that in the policy.
All right, well, does your organization even have a Bitcoin wallet?
But that's part of so that's part of the tabletop, right? And so as you run through that tabletop, you identify the gaps in your process that you don't have. Okay, we're going to make the decision we want to pay. Okay, how are we going to pay? We don't have any Bitcoin. Okay, well, that's a problem, right? We have to get out a PR statement. We don't have an external PR agency that's experienced in ransomware. Crap. Okay, we got to figure out how we're going to do that, right? But also bringing in all those pieces of the organization, because I see a lot of tabletops happen where people won't bring in. You'll bring in counsel a lot of times, but you may not bring in the head of sales or the head of marketing, or you're not going to bring in you don't want to pay, and you're not going to bring in the external cyber legal representation that you really need in that event, because your internal counsel understands business contract negotiation. He doesn't understand the nuances, right? You're probably now going to need someone who's a specialist in materiality and SEC regulations and reporting, an SEC lawyer, because if you don't have that, like you're going to be asking a lot of questions that nobody knows, right? The CISO is generally not the person who's making a materiality discussion. He's bringing the evidence to the table, but the internal counsel and the CFO, they're probably going to need some more feedback about that materiality discussion. So if you don't involve all the people you need in the tabletop, you're never going to bring in that emotional component of, oh, I didn't think about that. That's a hard question, right?
Okay. And then involving your insurance company, because in a
you
lot of
definitely
these, the insurance company is the one who's driving what's happening in the IR, what's happening in the negotiations. They're kind of so a lot of these decisions aren't internal decisions.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think so. You're not going to necessarily bring your insurance company into the tabletop, but what you should have conversations about with the insurance company ahead of time is, hey, what's our policy? Like, are you going to reimburse us if we have to pay? Right? What are the conditions?
What is this process like? Because I think there's parts of the process that aren't exposed, like working with a breach coach until that incident actually happens, right?
And you may think, hey, I'm going to go to Mandiant. I'm going to retain them. Can you? Like, are they on the list? Probably, but maybe not. Like, it all depends upon your insurance policy and how it's written. Like, you want to negotiate that stuff up front, have all that well understood. And compensating controls can be really effective in your discussions with the insurer, right? Too, because I would have, before you go up for renewal, you should probably have these conversations internally and say, like, what can we do to create a more effective control framework where we can advertise this to our insurer to hopefully get our policy down, or at least make sure we can get renewal.
Right. Show that you've actually gone through
you've
the
done
steps.
the work, right?
Yeah. So I think I wanted to jump back. There was a number of trends you had noted in the malicious quartile as well.
We've got so many things. Let's run through a few of these. Get a couple comments from you guys. Some of the trends that we're seeing from Q1, automation and exploits, we've kind of covered that. So we've got misconfigured SQL servers, TeamViewer, Fortra Go Anywhere. Again, that was
TeamViewer.
That was getting hammered before MOVEit, not quite as big. Citrix NetScaler still getting hit vulnerable Python libraries. I mean, the list goes on and on. Data exfiltration, of course, we just covered that a little bit. Huge problem. Healthcare, which we've talked about, I think, in every single show now. Another big breach, Ascension. Huge provider, hundreds of thousands of patients in Tennessee area, regional provider. We've got almost 2 weeks on, and when they're described the situation as absolute chaos. So they're doing everything by pen and paper. The machines that dispense medication so there's no mistakes aren't working, right? They can't scan the, you know, when you're in the hospital and they scan your little thing and they double check to make sure you're getting the right medications. There was even a patient's family who actually interceded when they were going to give their family member the wrong medication.
Jeez.
So I mean,
so records and charts were impacted.
Everything.
So
Charting.
talking about materiality, not only materiality on the cost side, but like that's life or death.
Yeah.
Ambulances being diverted to other hospitals,
Which then impacts other healthcare systems.
because they're getting
They're overloading
overloaded
the system.
Right.
As well, systemic risk, right? Like, how
Absolutely.
does that start to just expand outward and cause a bigger and bigger problem and bring down the whole system as a whole?
Something interesting about kind of what you mentioned prior to talking about this Ascension incident, the automation and exploitation of vulnerabilities in software, the rise in data exfiltration, and obviously a focus on healthcare that kind of mimics in sort of a vacuum what kind of some of the stuff we had seen in the DBIR as well. So, you know, obviously this data was prepared prior to the release of that DBIR, but it is, I guess, comforting to know
Yeah, it
that
lines
we're
up.
kind of tracking along some of the similar lines with our research.
Oh, absolutely. A couple other trends, of course, the LEO takedowns. We covered a little bit. Regulators, liability and lawsuits. I mean, there's just the lawsuits are just starting to come in. Everything on the legal side, of course, moves, you know, years slower than what's happening. So just from the events that are happening today, we're going to be hearing about class action lawsuits in 6 months to 6 years. You know.
Yeah, and I would look for CISOs to start being named in those lawsuits, right? I mean, they're going to be.
You'd have to
named
imagine, especially
parties,
like obviously, I think there was a discussion around United Health, right? And that's going to be an enormous lawsuit with many named parties.
Yeah, well, when you have, I think it was 24 attorneys general from across the country, hammering you for not being able to even report on the scope of the breach right now, whose records were impacted, but and when was the attack? January.
5 months in.
Yeah, so
I think it was
January, February,
several months
Yeah,
ago.
yeah. So very tough. How about just a couple of things generally in the news? Again, on the class action lawsuits, United Health Group. Where are we on that? Have you heard? I mean, have systems been restored? Are providers still, struggling?
I think there's still some. I've heard still some lingering impacts from that. Right, it's not fully finished yet. Right, and I think you're still probably looking at third-party impacts that are still well impacted because there's a ripple effect. It all doesn't just come back right away.
Yeah.
And I think there was 22 attorney generals from different states that kind of had at it with the CEO.
Yeah.
Right?
There's lots happen. Health and Human Services, Office of Civil Rights, investigating Change Healthcare over the leaked PHI of patients. Group Health Cooperative, South Central Wisconsin. 500,000 patients' data was exposed here in January. A U.S. fertility settled a class action lawsuit for just over $5.5 million following back in 2020.
Yeah, so that's what we were just talking about, right? The class actions that are going to stem from this, people are going to look for somebody to hold responsible.
Right? And there's a big latency period in there, so we're just seeing 4 years later the outcome from that. Regulations, is that the answer? Oh, good. Here comes the government, right?
Is it the answer? Is it necessary? Do they move slow? Exceedingly slow, probably. But ultimately, I think to your point about should you pay a ransom? Is there going to be some kind of an escrow fund that helps assist companies who are going through this? I'm not sure. I think ultimately everything ends in regulation, but.
How can the government best help? I mean, is it going to be with the carrot or the stick? The stick, should we be punishing organizations that are not doing their due diligence on the security side and have an event, or should we be incentivizing organizations to be able to adopt new technologies and, stay as current as they possibly can with risk mitigation?
Both, potentially. Like where do you want to start? I think with any kind of like huge regulatory fine, I think we've over the past 10 years seen, enormous regulatory fines, especially with like the implementation of like GDPR, right? Has any one of those companies that has paid a multi-million-dollar fine or above that gone out of business? No. Like
again, I go back to that initial. I think we talked about at the very, very start of this. Like, what's the alternative?
Right. Exactly.
Right. So if a major,
is it just the cost of doing business?
Yeah, I think that's in a way what companies look at it, and that's some of the discussion that happens at the boardroom and certainly at the C-suite is, what's our potential impact? How believable is it? Like, do we think we're going to lose, $20 million to this? Well, maybe.
Well, isn't that kind of the
over
point of how they
years.
structured GDPR and that?
And
so
that's
it's
risk.
like environmental thing. Okay, we can, if we have a spill, we've budgeted that in for the fines we're going to get. But something like GDPR, we're talking about, what's the percentage?
I think it's 4% of revenue, right?
That's gross revenue.
Yeah.
So that's significant. So does that move the needle when you start having penalties of that?
It certainly does move the needle, but like, it's such a complicated question, Anthony. Like yes, companies are really concerned. Like a very large company, General Motors and AT&T, whoever, they're concerned about a 4% of gross revenue impact because it's a big check that they got to write. But the question is, do they ever think they'll really get hit by it? And like, what's a big company that's gotten a 4% fine that we've actually seen pay it? Like, I can't really think about one, right? And so the risk discussion in the board, like any other risk, is like, I go to Carr's a lot, but back in the day, I think it was what was it, Ford that had the gas tank thing where they figured out it was like 10 cents a gas tank, to fix the problem, but like a couple people dying, like, didn't raise to 10 cents a gas tank. Yeah. So they were going to, just go with it as they had it. And then they had lawsuits and things happen. So I'm not a fan of the regulations. I think it's challenging because it's often done either heavy-handed or without the nuance to actually understand what's going on. But I do think in some cases it's necessary to get companies to actually understand that this isn't just it's a technical problem. We'll just move on and we'll pay the fines when we get them, or we'll pay the lawsuits when we get them. Right? It's got to actually have teeth in it to make something change. Because the discussion in the boardroom right now is really, we paid all this money for cyber over the last several years. How much more do you need? Right. Yeah. And they don't understand the concept isn't there because we don't have the technical representation in the boardroom. And I say technical in the sense that they understand the problem set, right? A lot of people on the board understand other technical areas of the organization, like the technical areas of finance. Going back, 20, 25 years now, like you didn't have to have somebody in the board who understood how to read a balance sheet. Right. That's crazy.
Which is shocking.
But now, like, everybody knows that in a board you have to have somebody who can understand the financial aspects of it. I think now we need somebody who sits in a board who understands that you need to understand the technical aspects of the company because every company's technical. Right.
Yeah, and just to kind of hammer that home, when we look at United Health's stock, essentially, right? It's about where it was prior to the large announcement, right? So how material was that actual impact? Will they have additional regulatory fines? Will they have lawsuits that come up from shareholders as well as patients that have leaked data? Absolutely. But, without more regulatory teeth, I think it's
if everything's material, is anything material?
Exactly. Nothing else, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're at about time, but maybe we'll just foreshadow a little bit of future discussion. It's election year. Ransomware is a huge problem. Do you think it's going to be something that comes up?
You want to touch the third rail of
I'm just kind of
election security?
Are we talking dangling chads?
It's May. Can we worry about that?
A little foreshadowing. So, but we have seen already, with some local elections that there's been some impact from some ransomware attacks down in Georgia, a swing state. So it's interesting. We'll any predictions? Is ransomware going to be a factor?
My prediction is ransomware will continue to be a problem across every organization and industry.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll leave it at that.
Concur.
We'll see where we go. Be sure to check out our recent ransomware attack site. I'm really excited because we've really increased the volume of attacks that we're able to capture. So check that out. It breaks down by industry and region. You can do some sorting features on there.
Yeah, if you're trying to convince your boss to invest in an anti-ransomware solution, if you're possibly a journalist, if you're somebody who writes about cyber, this is a resource for you, built for you. It's available on halcyon.ai under the resources or the learn section.
Yeah, learn section, recent ransomware attacks.
Yeah, I think you just updated with 3,000 something new, new attacks that have been, I guess, collated from like data leak sites. Is that correct?
Yes. That's correct. So
Fantastic,
we've really expanded our ability to capture as many of the attacks as possible every week.
And everyone loves a cyber pew pew map, right? Which is essentially what that is, but just for ransomware.
And then, of course, the power rankings, ransomware malicious quartile that dropped. We produce that every quarter, so check that out. Another free resource from us, and then of course follow us on social, and not too far off, we'll be at Black Hat again after a great RSA. We gave away a really cool guitar. Yeah,
Black Hat is upon us at this point in time.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, you want to just mention who got the guitar and?
Yeah, we can actually. We gave it to a worthy organization. It was Black Girls Hack, right?
Yeah.
That was the organization's full name. Really great group of folks that are doing something interesting in cyber. So
awesome. Are we going to have another guitar for Black Hat?
For Black Hat, I believe we'll do another random drawing for another Dave Bonvillain exclusive guitar. I think it's actually getting sent to me next week.
Custom hand painted.
Absolutely, it's sort of tradition at this point for us.
But the same guy who does guitars for like Steve Vai and
right, we'll have him on the show. I think it's at some point here.
Steve Vai or
not
Dave?
Steve Vai. Okay. I don't believe he wants to talk cyber with you, Anthony.
You never know. He may have some interest that we're not aware of.
Maybe, but.
Well, again, thank you guys.
Halcyon.ai is the place for all these fantastic resources like the malicious quartile, our ransomware attack maps, and some of the other statistics tracking that you do. And this is obviously available on YouTube as well as our blog itself, right?
Yep.
Fantastic.
Thanks again, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great being here. Thanks for the conversation.
Right. See you later.
Take care.